The year is 1942. The war in the Pacific is raging. Across the ocean, the United States has begun to fully mobilize its industry for total war. In the heart of the Midwest, in cities like Chicago and St. Louis, the landscape has changed. Once quiet shoe factories now run day and night. Long assembly lines hum as workers cut, stitch, and assemble military boots. Leather hides are stacked high, waiting to be shaped into footwear for millions of soldiers. Trucks arrive at all hours, unloading materials and hauling away finished boots bound for ports. Inside one factory, the air smells of leather and machine oil. Rows of workers move in rhythm. A man fastens soles while a woman checks laces and stitches. Each worker knows the speed required. There is no time for wasted motion. The factory whistle blows, but there are no real breaks. The work never stops. Production quotas rise every week. Supervisors post numbers on a chalkboard. Thousands of pairs finished, thousands more needed. This scene plays out across the country. Dozens of companies that once made shoes for stores now make combat boots for the military. Civilian styles disappear. Only military boots roll off the lines. The government has issued strict orders. Every soldier must be outfitted, no matter the cost. At the same time, material shortages have to be solved. Natural rubber imports are cut off by the war. The U.S. answers by building synthetic rubber plants almost overnight. Leather comes from cattle ranches across the Midwest, shipped by rail to tanneries that work nonstop. The scale is immense. By late 1943, the output is staggering. Reports show that over 100 million pairs of boots have been produced. These numbers are carefully tracked by the War Production Board. Each pair is labeled, boxed, and sent to supply depots. From there, they travel by train to coastal cities, loaded onto troop ships headed for Europe and the Pacific. The boots are more than just gear. They are a sign of America's unmatched industrial capacity. While this is happening half a world away, in Tokyo, Japanese military intelligence receives reports of U.S. production figures. Officers gather around a table as a translator reads the numbers. One officer frowns, thinking he must have heard wrong. 100 million pairs of boots. He asks for the report to be repeated. It is repeated slowly, clearly. The room falls silent. The officers look at each other. The number is more than they can comprehend. For the Japanese High Command, the figure is not just about boots. It means the U.S. can outfit an army far larger than anything Japan can field. Japan has limited resources and struggles to supply its own troops with basic equipment. In some island campaigns, Japanese soldiers fight in worn-out shoes or even barefoot. The humid jungles of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands rot leather and fabric quickly. Soldiers suffer from foot infections and injuries. Replacements are scarce. The contrast could not be sharper. In American factories, workers turn out boots by the millions. In Japanese camps, soldiers share a single pair between two men. This difference has real consequences on the battlefield. At Guadalcanal, U.S. Marines land with fresh boots, extra socks, and medical supplies. Their feet stay dry and protected. They can march long distances and fight effectively. Japanese soldiers, forced to march through swamps with inadequate footwear, weaken from disease and exhaustion before they even meet the enemy. Back in the U.S., the workers understand their role. Many are women who have joined the workforce for the first time. They see posters urging them to support the troops through their labor. Each boot they make, they are told, will help a soldier on the front lines. This sense of purpose keeps them going through long, grueling shifts. In interviews and letters, some workers write about the pride they feel knowing their work matters. Others simply focus on the task, knowing the war's outcome depends on production. The pace of production amazes even American officials. A War Department officer visits a plant and watches as hundreds of pairs roll off the line every hour. He writes in his report that the U.S. supply system can now replace an entire division's boots in a single day. This kind of scale is unheard of in military history. As reports continue to reach Tokyo, the Japanese High Command begins to grasp what they are facing. The U.S. can replace every lost pair of boots without slowing down. If they can make boots in these numbers, what about rifles, trucks, or planes? The realization spreads among Japanese planners. This is a war of attrition, and Japan is on the losing side. Scenes alternate between the two sides. In the US, a train filled with boot shipments pulls out of a station, heading to a port city. In Tokyo, officers sit in silence, staring at a map of the Pacific dotted with American supply lines. One officer breaks the silence. He says quietly that they cannot match this level of production. The others do not argue. They know it is true. The boots become a symbol of a larger reality. They show how the US has harnessed its industrial power to fight a global war. For Japanese soldiers, each captured pair is proof of the enemy's strength. For American soldiers, new boots arriving in camp mean comfort, health, and readiness for the next campaign. The production of 100 million pairs of boots is not just a number on a report. It is the visible edge of a vast supply chain that stretches from the Midwest to the farthest Pacific island. It shows how the war will be won, not just through battles, but through the relentless effort of factories, workers, and logistics. The United States in 1942 was a nation transformed by war. Almost overnight, civilian industries shifted to military production. Shoe companies that once made fashionable dress shoes for department stores began producing rugged combat boots. Brown Shoe Company and International Shoe Company, two of the largest manufacturers in the country, received direct orders from the War Department. They tore out old machinery and replaced it with new equipment designed for speed and volume. Factory floors were rearranged to handle the flow of raw materials on one end and finished boots on the other. Standardization became the rule. Before the war, the U.S. Army used several types of footwear, often varying by unit or region. That changed when the government issued strict specifications. Factories now produced standardized combat boots that could be worn by infantry, Marines, and engineers alike. Special models were created for unique conditions, such as paratrooper boots with reinforced ankles and jungle boots made with lighter materials and drainage vents. This reduced confusion in the field and simplified logistics. The sourcing of materials was a national effort. Leather was the primary material, and the Midwest supplied most of it. Cattle ranches in states like Kansas, Nebraska, and Texas sent hides to tanneries that operated around the clock. Rubber was a different challenge. Before the war, the U.S. imported natural rubber from Southeast Asia, but those supply lines were cut off by Japanese expansion. In response, the government launched an emergency program to produce synthetic rubber. New plants were built at record speed in places like Akron, Ohio. This synthetic rubber soon replaced the natural kind for soles and heels. Other components, such as eyelets, nails, and stitching thread, came from dozens of small suppliers spread across the country. Each shipment was carefully scheduled to keep the assembly lines moving without interruption. Inside a wartime boot factory, the process was highly organized. It began with the arrival of raw hides. These were inspected for quality and then cut into specific shapes using heavy steel dies. The pieces were sent down the line where workers stitched them together to form the upper portion of the boot. At the same time, soles were being molded and cured in another section of the factory. Once ready, the uppers and soles were joined using powerful presses and secured with stitching and nails. Laces were added last, along with a final inspection. Each finished pair was tagged with size and date before being boxed and sent to a shipping area. The speed of production was remarkable. Factories operated on a 3-shift schedule, running 24 hours a day. At peak output, some plants turned out thousands of pairs every hour. Supervisors tracked progress on large boards, noting daily and weekly totals. If a machine broke down, repair crews fixed it immediately to avoid slowing the line. The system resembled an army in its own right, with each worker and machine performing a precise role. Once boxed, the boots were loaded onto rail cars. Trains carried them to military depots across the country. From there, they moved to ports on both coasts. In warehouses, crates were stacked in neat rows, waiting to be loaded onto troopships bound for distant battlefields. The logistics were carefully planned so that soldiers arriving at the front would always have fresh supplies. By late 1943, the numbers were staggering. Reports compiled by the War Production Board showed that the United States had produced over 100 million pairs of boots. This figure included replacements for worn-out pairs, as well as reserves for new recruits. To put it into perspective, 100 million pairs were enough to equip an army of 50 million soldiers, each with 2 pairs. At the time, Japan's entire population was around 73 million. The sheer scale of production gave the US a logistical advantage that no other nation could match. In Tokyo, these numbers reached military intelligence officers through intercepted shipping reports and captured documents. The information seemed almost unbelievable. Japan struggled to equip its own troops. Many units received a single pair of boots per soldier for an entire campaign. In some cases, there were not enough to go around. Soldiers fought barefoot or improvised with cloth wrappings. When Japanese officers learned that America could produce boots faster than they could count them, the impact was profound. It meant the US could replace every lost pair without hesitation, while Japan could barely maintain basic supply levels. The difference was visible on the battlefield. American troops at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Bougainville landed with sturdy, reliable footwear. When a pair wore out, replacements arrived within days. In contrast, Japanese soldiers marched through jungle terrain with worn-out shoes or none at all. The constant exposure to mud and water caused infections and injuries. This weakened entire units before they ever faced direct combat. Back in the factories, workers understood the urgency of their task. Many had family members serving overseas. They saw posters reminding them that their work supported the war effort. The boots they made would protect soldiers in faraway places. For some, this connection brought a sense of duty. For others, it was simply hard, necessary work. Either way, the output kept rising. As the war continued, production techniques improved. New machines increased speed, and better materials extended durability. Engineers experimented with design changes based on feedback from the field. A pattern of constant improvement emerged, with every shipment better than the last. The focus was always on reliability and volume. The number itself, 100 million pairs, became a symbol of America's capacity for war. It represented more than footwear. It showed how a nation, when fully mobilized, could meet any demand, no matter how large. Every boot rolling off the line told a story of coordination between ranchers, tanners, machinists, and soldiers. It was a network that stretched from small towns in the Midwest to islands thousands of miles away in the Pacific. Japan could never match this system. Even as they fought fiercely on the battlefield, the imbalance in production grew wider. For every Japanese soldier struggling with worn-out gear, there were multiple American soldiers with fresh supplies ready to replace them. The scale of production decided the pace and outcome of the war long before final battles were fought. In the jungles of New Guinea, rain fell without stopping. Mud clung to every surface, thick and foul-smelling. Japanese soldiers marched for days through knee-deep swamp water. Their boots, if they had them, quickly rotted. Many men wrapped their feet in strips of cloth torn from uniforms. Others went barefoot, their soles cut and raw. Infection spread fast in the humid air. Trench foot, jungle rot, and open sore slowed entire units. Some soldiers could no longer walk. They were left behind, hidden in the undergrowth, to die quietly while the rest moved on. Food was scarce and supplies arrived late or not at all. Ammunition came in small crates carried by hand along narrow trails. There were no extra boots waiting at the end of the march. A single pair was expected to last for an entire campaign. When that pair failed, the soldier had nothing. Officers recorded these shortages in reports, but there was little they could do. Japan's shipping routes were under constant attack. Factories back home could not meet demand. Across the ocean, the American experience was different. At Guadalcanal, U.S. Marines came ashore in organized waves. Each man carried a full kit, including a fresh pair of combat boots. These boots were sturdy and standardized, built to withstand long marches through wet terrain. The Marines waded ashore, boots laced tightly, feet dry and protected. After the landing, they moved inland quickly, their speed and readiness giving them an edge. As the campaign went on, replacement boots arrived with the regular flow of supplies. When a soldier's boots wore out, he turned them in and received a new pair without delay. Quartermasters kept stacks of footwear in tents and depots, organized by size. This system allowed American units to stay mobile and ready for action. The difference was clear to both sides. Japanese soldiers watched from the treeline as Americans unloaded crates from landing craft. Among the crates were not just weapons and ammunition, but boots, socks, and medical supplies. These items, mundane at first glance, meant survival. American troops could march farther and fight longer because their feet remained healthy. Japanese units, crippled by injury and exhaustion, often broke apart before major battles even began. At Tarawa, the pattern repeated. Marines stormed a heavily defended beach under withering fire. The sand was sharp and hot, scattered with coral fragments. Barefoot soldiers would have been shredded within minutes. But the Marines advanced steadily, their boots providing both protection and traction. Even when they fell into seawater or blood-soaked sand, they remained steady on their feet. Behind the front lines, medics treated wounded men and handed out dry socks to prevent infection. Every detail was planned, and every need was met. Japanese defenders faced a harsher reality. Many of them had been stationed on the island for months with no resupply. Their boots were worn through, patched with rope or cloth. Some had none at all. The coral cut their feet open, and infection spread through the garrison. These men fought with courage, but their physical condition weakened them before the battle began. Commanders on the American side took note of this difference. Field reports often mentioned the enemy's lack of basic equipment. One report from Guadalcanal included an observation about captured Japanese gear. The boots were crude, the stitching weak, the leather poor quality. A Marine officer wrote that the enemy's footwear would not last a week in the jungle. By contrast, U.S. boots were durable and uniform in design. This gave American troops a consistent advantage. A captured Japanese officer provided a rare perspective. Interrogated after a battle, he expressed disbelief at the sheer quantity of American supplies. He said he had seen stacks of boots taller than a man, ready to be issued. To him, it seemed as if the Americans had endless resources. His own men, he explained, often fought barefoot or shared a single pair between two soldiers. He shook his head as he described the feeling of defeat that came from seeing such abundance. On Iwo Jima, the stakes were even higher. The volcanic terrain was rough and uneven, covered in ash and rock. Soldiers needed reliable footwear to climb ridges and move through fortified areas. American boots gripped the ground, allowing units to advance in close formation. Logistics teams followed closely behind, ensuring constant resupply. Japanese defenders fought from tunnels and bunkers, but their physical state was dire. Many had wrapped their feet in scraps of cloth to protect them from the harsh ground. Infection was rampant. As the battle dragged on, their mobility dropped sharply. Units that could not move freely became easy targets for coordinated American assaults. Throughout these campaigns, footwear became more than just a piece of gear. It represented the larger difference between the two armies. The Americans had a system that anticipated every need and met it. The Japanese relied on improvisation and endurance. When conditions were extreme, endurance alone was not enough. For American soldiers, the reliability of their boots built confidence. They could focus on their mission without worrying about whether their feet would hold up. Marches were longer, patrols more frequent, and operations more complex because their equipment supported them. This readiness boosted morale. A soldier who trusted his gear fought with greater determination. Japanese troops faced the opposite situation. Every step was painful. A march of a few miles could turn into a test of survival. Soldiers who fell behind were often lost to disease or enemy fire. Morale suffered, and units weakened before combat even began. In the end, the difference in footwear told a larger story about logistics and strategy. On the battlefield, it was visible in every movement. Americans advanced quickly and in good order. Japanese forces slowed, limped, and faltered. The jungle, the coral, and the volcanic ash were enemies as real as any opposing soldier. Commanders understood this well. They saw that every pair of boots shipped from the U.S. meant greater strength in the field. They also saw that every missing pair on the Japanese side meant weakness. Reports from these battles often focused on weapons and tactics, but the quiet factor of footwear was always present. It was a reminder that wars are fought not only with guns and bullets, but with the supplies that keep armies moving. The captured Japanese officer's words echoed through intelligence briefings. His awe at the American stockpiles confirmed what U.S. planners already knew. The war was not just about fighting. It was about sustaining that fight across vast distances. In that struggle, the side with the better boots and the means to replace them held a decisive edge. The room was quiet except for the rustle of papers. A single overhead lamp cast a pale circle of light on the table. Japanese officers sat rigid in their seats, their uniforms damp with the heat of a Tokyo summer. An intelligence officer cleared his throat and read slowly from the report he held in his hands. His voice was flat, almost mechanical, as he translated the intercepted information. 100 million pairs of boots. The words hung in the air. For a moment, no one spoke. A senior officer frowned and leaned forward. "Repeat that," he said. The officer read again, slower this time, each syllable sharp. "The Americans have produced 100 million pairs of military boots." The table erupted with low murmurs. One colonel muttered, "That's enough to march an army across the Pacific twice over." Another officer sat back in his chair, his face pale. He tapped a pencil against the table, counting silently. Japan's entire population was just over 70 million. The math was impossible to ignore. The intelligence officer laid out other figures: rifles, trucks, tanks, and planes. But it was the boots that struck hardest. Boots meant soldiers. Boots meant movement. Boots meant an enemy who could fight anywhere, for as long as it took. An older general, his voice hoarse, said what many were thinking. If they can make this many boots, they can replace every loss without slowing down. His words were followed by silence. No one offered a plan or a countermeasure. There was none. Across the ocean, in the American Midwest, the atmosphere was very different. Inside a large factory, women bent over sewing machines, their hands quick and precise. The rhythm of stitching filled the room, broken only by the hiss of steam presses and the hum of conveyor belts. Each woman knew why she was there. Many had husbands or brothers overseas. They had seen posters in the post office and on street corners urging them to do their part. One worker, a young mother from St. Louis, wrote in her diary after a 12-hour shift, "We are arming the soldiers with every stitch," she wrote. "When I sew a seam straight and tight, I think of my brother landing on some faraway beach. If his boots hold together, he comes home safe." In another letter, a factory foreman described the relentless pace. "We work night and day," he wrote. "The line never stops. When one shift leaves, another comes in. We've made so many boots I've lost count. But each pair has a name in my mind. Someone's son, someone's husband will wear them." The home front buzzed with activity. Railroads carried hides to tanneries, rubber to plants, finished boots to depots. Families read news articles about production milestones. The numbers were huge, almost beyond comprehension, but people took pride in them. They knew their labor reached across oceans to soldiers fighting in mud, sand, and snow. Letters from soldiers confirmed it. A Marine on Guadalcanal wrote to his parents about the supplies he received. "We have everything we need," he said. "The boots are strong and dry fast after a soak. The enemy doesn't have half of what we do. You should see what they wear on their feet, cloth rags, if anything. It makes you grateful for home." Another letter came from a paratrooper in Europe. "The quartermasters keep us well stocked," he wrote. "When my boots wore out after the last jump, I had a new pair in hours. The Germans and Japs don't have that luxury. It makes a difference you can feel every step of the way." On the other side of the war, Japanese soldiers told a different story. A journal recovered from a soldier on New Guinea described endless marches through mud and swamp. "Our feet are destroyed," he wrote. "The skin peels away. Some men can no longer walk. There are no replacements. We wrap our feet with cloth and pray it lasts until the next battle." Another account, from a captured soldier, was brief and bitter. "We fight without boots," he said. "The enemy has too many to count. We have none." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of defeat. As reports of American production continued to arrive, Japanese planners began to understand the wider picture. The shock turned to dread. They could not replace their losses fast enough. Even victories felt hollow when they knew the Americans would return, stronger and better supplied. In Tokyo, the briefings grew tense. Charts and maps covered the walls. Red pins marked Japanese positions across the Pacific. Blue lines showed American supply routes stretching like veins across the ocean. Each new report confirmed the same reality. The enemy's strength was growing, not shrinking. One evening, after another grim meeting, a junior officer lingered behind. He stared at a photograph of an American factory, rows of workers and machines filling the frame. In the image, he saw the scale of the challenge. It was not just a war between armies. It was a war between entire nations, between their ability to sustain the fight. Back in the US, families gathered around radios, listening to war news. They did not hear the details of production numbers, but they felt the results. Soldiers wrote home, safe and well-equipped, because somewhere in the Midwest a factory worker had done her job. For the soldiers on the front lines, the difference was clear every day. When they opened supply crates, they saw stacks of boots, each pair ready to be worn into battle. It gave them confidence. They knew they could keep moving forward. For Japanese soldiers, the sight of those same crates brought despair. Every captured shipment showed the imbalance. They could fight bravely, but bravery alone could not replace worn-out gear. In the jungle, on the beaches, and in the volcanic ash of islands like Iwo Jima, the weight of that truth pressed down on them step by step. The reactions of generals, workers, and soldiers formed a single, shared reality. The boots were more than leather and rubber. They were proof of the vast machinery of war, a reminder that the conflict reached from distant battlefields to the smallest towns at home. Every pair carried with it the hands that made it, the feet that wore it, and the minds that understood what it meant. The report was laid out on the table in silence. Japanese officers stared at the columns of numbers. Boots were only the first line. The figures went on. Rifles by the millions, trucks by the hundreds of thousands, tanks, artillery pieces, and warplanes in quantities no other nation could match. The sheer scale was beyond imagination. One officer tapped the paper with his finger. "These are not just numbers," he said. "They are soldiers, divisions, fleets." Another officer leaned back, his face pale. "If they can make 100 million pairs of boots, they can make anything," he said. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. The room was heavy with the smell of sweat and tobacco. Outside, the streets of Tokyo were dark from nightly blackouts. The empire was stretched thin across a vast ocean. Supply lines were fraying, and every island garrison begged for reinforcements that could not be sent. The boots had become more than leather and rubber. They were a symbol of industrial might, proof that the United States could bring overwhelming force to bear. For every Japanese soldier sent to a Pacific island, the Americans could send 5, each fully equipped. And when one was lost, another would take his place within days. Reports from the front confirmed this imbalance. On Guadalcanal, Japanese troops fought with courage but received little resupply. They faced an enemy whose supply lines never seemed to falter. Crates of ammunition, food, and boots arrived with every wave of landing craft. American units stayed at full strength while Japanese regiments shrank with every battle. A naval officer pointed to a map marked with red and blue lines. The red lines represented Japanese shipping routes. The blue lines were American. The blue lines spread like a web across the Pacific, reaching out from Hawaii, Australia, and the U.S. West Coast. The red lines were thin, broken in places by American submarines and carrier strikes. "Our enemy has mastered logistics," the officer said. "They can fight on multiple fronts because they can move men and supplies wherever they are needed. We cannot match this." No one argued. They had all seen the reports. At Tarawa, the Americans had brought in enough equipment to sustain weeks of fighting. At Bougainville, they had built airfields in a matter of days. The ability to project power across thousands of miles was unlike anything Japan had faced before. A general rubbed his temples and spoke plainly. "This is a war of attrition," he said. "They can replace every loss. We cannot. Even if we win a battle, it means little if they can return stronger the next month." His words were met with silence. The younger officers avoided his gaze. They all understood what he meant. The empire was locked in a struggle it could not sustain. By 1944, the picture became even clearer. American production had reached its peak. New tanks rolled off assembly lines in Detroit. Aircraft carriers were launched every few weeks from massive shipyards. Bombers filled the skies over Japan's home islands. The factories that had produced boots were mirrored by factories producing every other tool of war. At a strategy meeting, one intelligence officer summarized the situation. "They are building not just to fight us here," he said, pointing to the Pacific map, "but to fight in Europe at the same time. They have enough to fight 2 global wars at once." The weight of that statement settled over the room. Japan had committed nearly all of its resources to the Pacific alone, and it was barely enough. The thought of an enemy with limitless reserves was crushing. In the field, Japanese commanders saw the effects firsthand. Reports from Iwo Jima described endless waves of well-supplied American troops. When a unit took heavy casualties, replacements arrived almost immediately. New equipment appeared as fast as the old wore out. In contrast, Japanese defenders fought with dwindling ammunition and no replacements. Once a unit was gone, it was gone forever. One captured Japanese officer spoke candidly during interrogation. He said his men had fought bravely but were defeated before the battle even began. "You have no limits," he told his captors. "We have only what we can carry." Even before the great battles at Leyte Gulf and Okinawa, Japanese planners knew the end was coming. Their own production figures told the story. Factories damaged by bombing raids could no longer meet even basic needs. Shipyards struggled to repair damaged vessels while the Americans launched new ships faster than they could be sunk. Strategists began to shift their thinking. Instead of planning for victory, they began to plan for delay. The goal was no longer to win outright, but to hold out long enough to negotiate a settlement. Every island garrison was ordered to fight to the last man. Every battle became a test of endurance, meant to buy a little more time. But even these plans were built on hope rather than strength. The flow of American supplies was unstoppable. At Okinawa, entire divisions were fully equipped before the first shot was fired. When a landing craft hit a mine, another was waiting to take its place. When a tank was destroyed, a replacement rolled off the next transport ship. The Japanese High Command received updates throughout the battle. Each message painted the same picture: overwhelming force meeting dwindling resistance. Generals read these reports in silence, knowing there was nothing they could send to change the outcome. The 100 million boots that had shocked them months before were now only part of a larger machine. Tanks, planes, carriers, and guns flowed endlessly to the front. The boots were the foundation, the first visible sign of an enemy with resources beyond calculation. As the war stretched on, even the most optimistic planners began to admit the truth. Japan's position was collapsing. The empire had been built on speed and daring in the early years of the war. Now it was being crushed by weight and numbers. The Americans could fight on every island, every sea lane, every front, and never run out of men or material. The meetings in Tokyo grew quieter. The officers still gathered around their maps and charts, still marked movements and planned defenses. But in their hearts, they knew the tide had turned. The numbers told the story. For every Japanese soldier fighting barefoot in the jungle, there were 5 Americans landing in fresh boots, ready to take the next step forward. When the war finally ended, the factories went quiet. Machines that had once run day and night stood still. Workers returned to their homes, some to families they had barely seen in years. The massive wartime effort that had produced everything from bombers to boots began to wind down. But the lessons learned did not fade. In the months after the surrender, military planners and industrial leaders studied the data. They looked at production charts and shipping logs. They reviewed how factories had been converted from peacetime goods to the tools of war. Among the examples they studied, the story of the boot factories stood out. It was simple to understand yet powerful in meaning. 100 million pairs of boots had been produced and shipped across the globe. This required not just leather and machines, but coordination on a national scale. The production process became a case study in total war mobilization. Historians and military analysts documented each step. They examined how civilian shoe companies like Brown Shoe Company and International Shoe Company had shifted overnight to military contracts. They noted how the government standardized designs to simplify logistics. They recorded how the supply chain worked, from cattle ranchers in the Midwest to tanneries, rubber plants, shipping depots, and finally to the front lines. These studies shaped future planning. The U.S. military realized that logistics could not be improvised in wartime. It needed to be built, tested, and ready long before the first battle. The boot factories showed how even a basic item could require complex coordination. In later decades, these lessons guided the creation of modern military supply systems. Computerized tracking, global transport networks, and standardized equipment all had roots in the methods first used during World War II. The post-war years also brought reflection among veterans. For many American soldiers, the boots were more than gear. They were a symbol of the support they received from home. Veterans often spoke about how well they had been supplied compared to their enemies. In interviews and memoirs, they recalled opening crates of fresh boots and dry socks after long marches. These simple items boosted morale and kept them fighting. One Marine remembered his first landing on a Pacific island. "We hit the beach under fire," he said. "I looked down and saw my boots sinking into the sand, holding steady. That small thing made a difference. I knew I could run, fight, and keep moving. The enemy didn't have that." Another veteran, an Army paratrooper, wrote in his memoir about jumping into Europe. He described the confidence he felt knowing that replacements for his boots and other gear would be there when needed. "It wasn't just about comfort," he wrote. "It meant we could keep going. No matter how hard the fight, we didn't have to stop." These memories were often contrasted with what they saw of their enemies. Captured Japanese boots were thin and poorly made. Some were patched with rope or cloth. Soldiers taken prisoner sometimes had no boots at all, only rags tied around their feet. American troops understood what that meant. They saw it as proof that the war was as much about production as it was about combat. On the home front, factory workers carried their own memories. Many women who had entered the workforce during the war returned to their homes afterward, but they did not forget the experience. Some kept photographs of their production lines. Others saved patches from their work uniforms or letters from soldiers who had worn the boots they made. In small towns across the Midwest, people told stories of the war years. They remembered the long shifts, the constant motion, the sound of machines never stopping. They spoke of the pride they felt when they saw pictures of soldiers overseas wearing boots they had helped create. In many communities, the factories were more than workplaces. They were symbols of shared purpose. Historians later referred to this as part of the arsenal of democracy. The term captured the idea that victory came not only from battlefields but from assembly lines and shipping docks. The figure of 100 million pairs of boots became a piece of that story. It appeared in textbooks, documentaries, and speeches. It was a number that illustrated the vast scale of the American war effort. The boots also became a metaphor. They stood for the idea that strength is built step by step, through preparation and organization. Veterans sometimes spoke of how the boots reminded them of the connection between the front lines and the home front. Each pair represented thousands of hands working together. As the decades passed, the physical boots wore out and disappeared, but their impact remained. Military planners continued to study the war, using its lessons to shape future conflicts. The systems developed during World War II evolved into the complex supply networks of the modern era. The concept of standardized equipment and mass production became a permanent part of military strategy. At reunions and commemorations, veterans shared stories of the war. They talked about battles and comrades lost, but also about the small details that had mattered in the moment. Often, those details came back to simple things like boots, a dry pair of socks, a reliable sole, a piece of gear that never failed. These were memories that stayed long after the fighting ended. For the Japanese side, the memory carried a different weight. Scholars and military historians examined how shortages had shaped strategy and morale. They compared their production numbers to those of the United States and saw the gap clearly. The lack of basic supplies like boots became part of the story of defeat. It was a reminder that courage alone could not overcome material weakness. In museums today, examples of World War II combat boots are displayed alongside uniforms and weapons. Visitors see them as artifacts, simple in design but rich in meaning. Plaques explain how they were produced, shipped, and worn. The story they tell is not just about footwear, but about the power of organization and the scale of a nation at war. Even decades later, the image remains vivid. Rows of boots lined up in a factory, ready to be boxed and sent to the front. Workers bent over sewing machines, soldiers opening crates on distant shores. The number 100 million still has the power to surprise. It speaks to the reach of a wartime economy and the collective effort of millions of people. In quiet moments, some veterans reflected on how that effort shaped the world they lived in afterward. The boots they had worn in battle were long gone, but the legacy of what they represented remained under every step they took in peace.